In this video, I'm going to tell you about how many hobbies I think make up our wargaming hobby. So, in last week's video, I talked about completion within the hobby and how some hobbies have completion, which is to say output, an actual physical thing that you can look, hey, check this out, look at this miniature I painted, or look at this fish that I caught and paid somebody to stuff, or whatever. And then there are hobbies that don't have that, like, say, video games or I don't know, speed walking and stuff like that. So there's lots of different options, and there was a lot of interesting stuff in the comments, which you might want to check out. You should check out the video anyway. I think it was even though it seemed at the time a little scatterbrained, it resonated. Pachow. So anyway, during that video, as I was kind of scatterbrainedly, is that a word? Anyway, as I was talking, I also brought up the concept of like how our hobby, tabletop wargaming, isn't just a hobby, isn't just one hobby, it's multiple hobbies. Some people say it's 2, some people say it's 3. It can be a lot of different hobbies, I guess, but the question really that's out there is, why do you care? Why is this important? I think it's important because it's kind of a good idea to know what you're getting into if you are getting into this hobby. And this channel is very frequently aimed towards people who are getting into the hobby. That being said, if you've been in the hobby for a while, and maybe this is your first time here at this channel, or you've been in the hobby for a while and you've been watching these videos for a while, it still might be a good idea to sort of understand what your role and your goals, what you hope to get out of the hobby, what these things are. So I think the easiest way to break it down is that, in my opinion, there are 2 parts to this hobby. Now, people in the comments for the last video said, well, there's building and then there's painting, or there's, and you can get that categorized potentially. But if that's the case, we can do that all across the board. We could then say this hobby is 17 hobbies, which gets real difficult because we could say, well, there's the painting, but within painting, there's brush painting and there's airbrushing, plus there's rattle cans. So that's technically 3 things right there, and then there's kit bashing, there's following the instructions, there's filing, there's sanding, so we kind of want to maybe compress a little bit of that just to make it something that we can all keep, in our brains. I look at it this way. In general, tabletop wargaming is 2 things. It is the craft, everything from building all the way up to finished paint, right? Boom, the craft. And then there's the play. And one of those doesn't necessarily need the other, and the other one kind of does need the other. This is not a judgment on anybody's particular interest within the overall, tabletop wargaming hobby. But the craft portion of it doesn't particularly require the play portion of it, whereas the play portion sort of requires the first part in some fashion. So let me try to explain this to you. There are plenty of people out there right now who build and paint and build and paint and build and paint and never play. They have no interest in playing. They've never bought a codex. They've never even bought the main big thick rule book or an army list or any of that kind of stuff. Depending on whatever kind of game it is, they buy the models and they paint them because they like having them. They like the process of actually doing, right? And then they like the completion. They like having it finished and go, there you go. There are people out there who play, just play, never build, never paint. But it's kind of rare because at the very least, you sort of have to build the little people. Now, there are a couple of games, far fewer than there used to be, out there that are completely pre-built and pre-painted. Like you got HeroClix. I can't think of any others anymore. There used to be more. There was a D&D skirmish game. There was a Star Wars skirmish game that came with little pre-painted kind of people and stuff like that. And there were other games, AT-43, Confrontation. There used to be more. There are far fewer now. Most of them really kind of more depend upon the craft portion, and that's fine. You, as a person who just wants to play, can pay somebody. Or you can trick your spouse into it, or whatever, and get them to do the building and the painting, or whatever, and then go from there. But this part, just being the gaming person and not having anything to do with the other part, is a little bit more difficult. Whereas just building and painting and never going to a tournament, never playing, never even cracking the book, that happens all the time. Now, I can see some of you in the back who are raising your hands and saying, but Uncle Adam, you forgot about the lore. That's a super important part of the hobby. And It is, but predominantly just for certain parts of the hobby. So they may be the biggest parts, and I'm talking about Warhammer. Warhammer has probably, in my opinion, actually 3 parts of the hobby. It has obviously the craft, it has the playing, and then it has the actual story, the lore, as it's generally known as, and that is very, very, very big in the Warhammer thing, but it's not necessarily big in the other things. Let me try to explain this to you. So, for those of you who don't know, Games Workshop has their entire publishing arm. They have a completely separate publishing arm that just publishes, for the most part, fiction. I don't think they maybe do any instructional books anymore, like how to paint stuff or how to build terrain, things like that. I don't know that Black Library has done any of that kind of stuff recently, but Black Library is the name of the publishing arm, and they have hundreds of novels written by a wide range of different authors about both Warhammer Fantasy, which is now Age of Sigmar, or the 40K stuff, the sci-fi stuff. Zillions of them. Okay, not zillions, but like I said, hundreds of different novels out there. So there are folks out there who just will watch videos about the lore. They just read the books. They've read all the books. They've never touched a model, probably. I mean, not in a crafting way. They might have moved one around at the game store a little or whatever, but they've never actually built a model, and they've never played the game. They've never sat down, rolled dice, flipped through the book, all that stuff. Only some of the biggest companies out there have that third arm, that lore portion of them. I know that there's always what's usually referred to as fluff in the rule books. Nearly any rule book that you're going to get for nearly any miniatures game is going to have some sort of story in it, so you know what's going on. But there's rarely ever somebody who is like, all right, well, I'm only interested in the lore of Game X, when Game X is relatively new and just has one book, and there's literally only 1,000 words about the story of what Game X might be. But when you've got decades of books out there, and it's not just, Warhammer. There's also, I know there's plenty of novels out there for Battletech, if you're into that kind of stuff. I'm pretty sure there have been novels out there for War Machine. If not, so many of their books have come out in the past, both War Machine and Hordes, where there are rules, but at least half story, that, maybe that counts. But that's another kind of aspect. If you're playing, let's say, a historical game, let's say you're playing something that is World War II, there's no lore there. There's history. You can read history books, but you can do that and not have anything to do with gaming. And no one even asks and goes, well, why are you reading about this stuff? And you're like, because it's history. It happened in World War II. And people would be like, oh, yeah, duh. But if you were sitting there reading a novel about space marines running around shooting each other or whatever, somebody who's not, into that whole thing might look at it and go, well, what's this all about? And then you kind of have to explain it. And then depending on the person and depending on how you explain it, you sound crazy or whatever the problem is. But, it's not necessarily for everyone. There is not particularly lore in normal historical games like there are in some of the other games. And lore, though a big portion, and there are plenty of people who just only touch the miniatures world through lore, I don't count it because I don't think it fits for all the different miniature games that are out there that are available. I found that there's also kind of an interesting thing that goes on between those two main things in wargaming, the craft and the play. If you're interested in the craft, there are some folks out there who just love to build and convert, and then they stop there and they never paint. There's some. Most people who get into the craft, if you're interested in getting into the craft, you can totally do it. It's not hard. There's plenty of videos here on YouTube about it. But in most situations, it goes all the way from I'm going to buy this bottle to I have now finished painting it. There are folks that I know personally who just build and convert and they never paint, and that's fine. That's what they like to do, and that's cool. They generally also don't go on necessarily to the gaming part. But there are also folks out there who build and never paint, but still game. That's fine too. You can do that. I prefer to play against a painted army, but we've had those conversations here on the channel before. But on the gaming side, there are plenty of folks who get involved with the gaming side and never get to the actual gaming part. There are a lot of folks out there on a lot of different, now these days, Discords, but back in the day, forums and things like that, doing theory crafting, Math Hammer, just list building. And I can tell you for a fact, because I know some of these folks, people who spend a good portion of nearly every single day talking on Reddit, talking on Daka, talking on Discord about strategy and list building and things like that. They own no models and they've never played. Frequently they own the books, not always, but a lot of times, sometimes they own the books and they will talk and theory craft and talk about the strategy and talk about it without ever having actually played a game. There's nothing wrong with that. I think it's a little weird, but there's nothing wrong with it. I think you should do what you want to do, because that's so much about the hobby, is doing what you want to do. And if you want to just paint models that your spouse builds because you hate building and they like building and hate painting, you've got a great situation there. That's awesome. Or if you've got a really good friend who loves to build and convert but never likes to paint, and you love to paint the stuff that they build and convert, great. If you love to help your friends who do play and actually maybe build and paint things, and you want to help them by scouring the internet to find all the best different strats and do all that kind of stuff, you can do that as well, even though you don't actually ever play the game. You can give them all kinds of information and tips and tricks and say, I found this list that this person talked about, but I think this part's wrong because it actually should be this, and blah, blah, and all that jazz. There's so many different things that you can do within this hobby that makes it very different from a lot of other hobbies. My dad used to tie flies. He used to tie little flies that you would then fish with. But he did both of them. There were very few people that he knew who just tied flies and never fished. Now, you could just fish and just buy flies in the store, or buy flies from somebody who, generally ties them, at home on the kitchen table like my dad did. But that doesn't mean generally, like, the person who ties flies very frequently also knows what happens when they put them in the water and that kind of stuff, and the fish. And so they're doing that stuff as well. And most hobbies are a very end-to-end. Most people do the same thing within this hobby. There are people play certain types of video games, other people play this type of video games and that kind of stuff. But a lot of the things, when you start to, organize it, are the same. Within our hobby, there are so many nooks and crannies that you can get into and just be interested in. I love the lore, and I'm really interested in that. And you can be reading books and watching videos on YouTube about lore and reading wikis and stuff like that for a decade. And then all of a sudden one day you think, I'm going to go buy a box of models. And now you've got that portion that is available to you. It's such a great hobby because it has so many different aspects to it. Just to be very clear, I want to say it's 2 hobbies. But really within each one of those, there's so many different little parts that, that would make a much longer title if I had to explain it all. But I really think that it's the craft and it's the gaming, and that's what makes it, I think, really interesting to me and to probably a lot of you. And if you're thinking about getting into the hobby, definitely understand that if you're just interested in this, but you're not interested in that, that's okay. Maybe you'll change your mind down the road, but no one's going to think you're weird if you're only into this one little thing within the wargaming hobby. 1, 2, 3, folks.